Blender 5.2 is now officially released, and as with every release of Blender, there are a lot of changes, both big and small, and a lot of optimizations that get made. In this video, I really want to dive into what changes I think will impact a game asset pipeline within Blender though. Really diving into which changes I think are going to make the biggest impact on a game asset pipeline, and with Blender 5.2 being an LTS release, I could see this being a really fantastic candidate to fully integrate into a game asset pipeline. Starting off strong, I want to talk about some of the modeling updates with Blender 5.2. One of the biggest ones being that the loop tools is now getting officially added into Blender. Now, right now we only have access to circle, space, and flatten. But those are some of the biggest ones. If we take a look here at how those function. Now, if you're familiar with loop tools, which you probably are, you'd know that you would go under the edit menu here, loop tools, and you can select it here. You could also right click loop tools and select your option there like circle. And this is a great example of showing how loop tools has actually been improved natively. So it's just the loop tools extension being used. But if we undo that and we go under mesh transform and do to circle, you can see that is where the new loop tool has been added natively within Blender. If we actually compare those two, you'll see that the official version actually works a little bit better in terms of keeping our edges straight here, instead of adding a little bit of a random rotation that you have to account for. So because the loop tools are now native, they actually have a little bit better performance, and they have a little bit more options here as well. So you can now do space evenly. So you have to choose space evenly to make sure that the vertices are spaced evenly across, or if you don't care so much about that, you can have that off. You can adjust rotation still, of course. You can choose between interior fit or best fit. You can also change the radius, just like the loop tools add-on, and you can adjust the factor as well. And what's really cool is you can adjust the flatten ratio. So if we choose some faces, say these ones over here, we do a tool here, we choose see flatten, and we can adjust it as a ratio, which is pretty nice instead of having to just use flatten or not. Now, the next one that was added in is mesh transform, and then we do space edge loops evenly. And you can see, it evenly spaces our edge loops. Now, where this is a little bit different and in some ways not as good as the loop tools add-on is the loop tools add-on version. If we go to space, has the option to turn on input as parallel all, in which case it will go ahead and perfectly space out the entire parallel loops there. Whereas with the official built-in version of the loop tools for spacing, you need to select all of them, which if we just select here, and then if we go and select edge loops, and then we run that command, we can run it just like that. So you can still do that, but now you do have to manually select all of those edge loops. Whereas before with the loop tools, you could just go loop tools, space, and set parallel. So that is a small change. It's not that big of a deal to me personally, but worth being aware of. Next off is flatten, which once again, mesh transform and then flatten. And it works pretty great. It'll initially try to flatten it based on best fit, but you can also flatten it by normal, and you can flatten it by view, which will try to flatten it to face the direction that you are viewing. All of these are very useful, and it's pretty much one-to-one as far as what the loop tools version has. We go on to loop tools version, we have best fit, normal, and view. So all of the same options. And as far as I can tell, this one kind of works exactly the same. Now with these loop tools that are natively built in, they're kind of built in from the ground up using C++. So in theory, it should have better performance on assets that have a much higher poly count, although I've not really gone to test that too much myself yet. Moving on to UV editing. There are a few changes in here. Quick cat break. Okay, moving on to the UV editor, there are a few more selection options you have available for you here. Go into select all by trait. A couple of new options in here. I personally think overlap is probably going to be the most useful one. It'll let you make sure you don't have any overlapping mesh islands, so you can, if you do, you can select them and then move them around to make sure they aren't overlapping anymore. Another addition is snap points have been added in. So if you turn on snapping, say we have it on grid here, and removing, we can add snap points by pressing A here. So if we want to, we can press A there, there, and A there, and it will try to snap it in between each of these points. So snap points just lets you get a little bit more finer control over how your snapping works within the UV editor, which can be pretty useful if you are trying to pack your UVs manually and really try to get them to fit in specific spaces. Another change that's also been added in here is if we go and say select these and we add in a new edge seam here, we can now unwrap, and instead of having it fill up our entire UV space, we can unwrap an individual island by doing original bounds. Now try to unwrap it within the original bounds that the UV island was in originally. It's like a little hard to understand, so if we, for instance, just that, if we make it very small, maybe over here, and then we unwrap once again, and you can see it'll still try to maintain that same general size within the UV bounds. So this can be helpful if you are trying to keep your mesh islands organized by material type or anything like that, so you no longer have to worry about it suddenly filling up the entire UV space, having to scale it back down to the right size. Just an additional little add-on to help streamline the process of UV editing. Next off, there are some really cool changes that have been added to sculpting. There are two new tools that I think are going to be really useful. First off, a nice little quality of life improvement. If you turn on Dyn Topo, it no longer has a pop-up and will instead have this little warning down here telling you what is not going to be preserved, which is quite nice if you're having to go back and forth, turning on dynamic topology, turning it off, flip back and forth. You no longer have that pop-up every single time you do it. It's a very tiny thing, but it is a nice quality of life improvement. Now, the first tool that has been added in here is the Scene Project Brush. This acts sort of like a shrink wrap modifier that you have artistic control over. So you can adjust how far away, if we go into the settings here, and just how far away our minimum distance, that's how close what we are trying to project is going to get to what is it's being projected onto. And you can project based on view normal or plane normal. So view normal, for instance, here on this shirt is going to base it based on the direction that we are looking. So if we're doing this, we can now see we could make this a very tight shirt if we wanted to. You can also do plane normal, which goes off of the normal of the object itself. So in this case, even though I'm not facing that direction on the sleeve, it's going to move the sleeve down inwards onto the bicep of our character here. All of these are very useful, and I imagine these tools are going to be incredibly useful for things like clothing, for instance here. But I also imagine these could be useful for other things as well, possibly even making it into some retopology workflows, although I've not had much time yet to really dive into experimenting with that. Next tool is one I think that is, again, another really great quality of life improvement, and that is the Add tool. So you can add a few different primitive shapes directly within sculpt mode onto your mesh. So this kind of will help out with blocking out a character. For instance, if we use the cylinder option here, click and drag, it'll let you decide the radius of your cylinder, and then you can decide how far out it goes. If you press Alt, it will move its pivot to be centered here. You can also hold down the Shift key, adjust the aspect ratio as well. So you can do a fixed aspect ratio and have a perfectly set cylinder, or, you know, whatever size you want here. So if you add on a couple cylinders, let's say we want to add on some UV spheres as well, add those on, hold down Shift, we can kind of make more of a capsule shape if we want to. We can do cones as well. And of course we can do cubes. We have a lot of options here, and then, you know, use Control R, do a quick remesh, and it will attach it all onto your object here. So now you can start to really sculpt out something if you want. So I think this will be a really great tool to get some blockouts done fully within sculpt mode, as well as add some extra bulk onto a character instead of having to just constantly add that detail with clay strips or an inflate brush. You can now just add on the primitive on there to get that bulk and then remesh, and you already get all that bulk for you. So it's just an additional tool I think is going to be very useful for creating game assets within Blender. Next off, there are a couple of rigging and animation changes that I think are worth mentioning here. Starting out with rigging here, if we have a rig that we are currently working on here, say we have our character's arms here. Let's say this is the main arm, so we have main upper arm, forearm, and hand. Let's say this character has 4 arms. So we want to go and duplicate this. Now regularly, if we went to duplicate this and move it down, we're going to get this 0.001 at the bottom there, which is a little bit annoying. Well, now you can go under armature and you can do duplicate and rename, which will let us have the option to replace part of the name. So we can search for main and we can replace it with secondary. Now if we do that and we move this arm down, we'll now see we have secondary hand, secondary forearm, and secondary upper arm. And of course, this still symmetrize as well here. So now we have a very basic little rig here with 4 arms and 2 legs. That is just going to be a very useful way of doing rigs that have a lot of similar connections. So like if you're doing like a spider and it has a whole bunch of legs, you can now duplicate those using that and not have to worry about getting rid of the 0.001 at the end and just name it as you duplicate it. Of course, if any of these changes within Blender, whether it's the new loop tools, a sculpting change, or rigging change, any of that, you can always go over one of these options, right click it, add it to your quick favorites menu, or you can assign a custom keyboard shortcut to it. Next off, and this is a very rough and ready animation here, so this character is going to look a little strange, but there are a few new playback modes available for you. So if we look at this very rough animation, we'll see this little cat character's waving his arms back and forth. And of course it starts at the beginning and ends, and that's how the playback has worked for Blender for a long time. But now we have a few different options. We can stop at the end frame, so playback will stop at that last frame. We can stop at the start frame, so then playback will end at the first frame that we went to. We can also change it to be restore frame, so say we're on frame 23, hit play, it will jump back to frame 23. And what I think will be possibly the most useful for animation is the bounce option. What this option does is it will play the animation fully going forwards, and then it will reverse it, and then forwards, and then back and forth. So it bounces back and forth. I think that's going to be particularly useful as it'll let you really analyze your animation, see what it looks like going forward, see what it looks like going backwards, and you can spot some weird details. So, maybe some of these arm details you wouldn't have noticed initially just going forward, but they might stick out a little bit more to you when it's going backwards. So just a nice little touch, nice little quality of life improvement in the animation pipeline within Blender. Next up, let's talk geometry nodes. Geometry nodes is of course getting really massive updates. It seems like every single release of Blender. 5.2 is no different. Geometry nodes is something that could take hours and hours to go over and learn. And while there's a lot of geometry nodes that maybe aren't as useful for game asset production, there is a lot that can be very useful for it. You can make a lot of tools that can help streamline creating assets, whether that is fully generating assets using geometry nodes or some other process of the game asset workflow. One of the biggest changes coming to geometry nodes in 5.2 is cloth simulations as well as hair dynamics. I'm not going to go over hair dynamics because I don't think that's as useful for game asset production. You could use it where you're creating like a game trailer or something, but if you're going to export it, hair dynamics don't really play a part in that. Now, simulations are actually really useful for creating game assets, even just the basic simulations here. So this is the original cloth simulations. Can be super useful for creating like a cushion, for instance. If we run that simulation with just a little bit of pressure here, puffs up this object and creates a nice little cushion. And if we want to, we can apply these modifiers. Take this line here, maybe bevel it a little bit. Take that line, maybe shrink it down just a little bit there, fade smooth, and now we have a very nice looking cushion that we could easily export out into a game and it would work just fine. These kind of simulations can also be useful if you're creating like curtains in your game here. You can go through, simulate some curtains so you have a nice, more natural looking movement, and then you have these curtains that you could then export out into your game. But one of the biggest changes with Blender 5.2 with the cloth simulations and geometry nodes is the ability to do cloth tearing. Now, cloth tearing, this can be super useful, doing some cloth tearing to get some natural looking rips in cloth, so you can then export that so you can get some really nice looking game assets. Of course, you can't always just use texture painting. I've tried to think of a workflow of how to combine that, of using just texture painting with cloth tearing. I kind of came up with this little workflow here where if you have a cloth here, look at the UVs here, see it's a pretty basic cloth. All of our UVs are set, and what I did is I duplicated that cloth and I added a lot of subdivisions, and I also used poke faces so that we have a bunch of tries here, and then we have these collider objects here. So we have cloth dynamics turned on, we have pins on each corner there. I've also turned gravity off. If we begin at the start here, we hit play, and then we move our objects through. See, we will rip through. Let's make sure we hit pause before it finishes. I have some really nice tears here. So now if we take this cloth and we apply, see we have a bunch of extra vertices here. Now you can't really export this because it does create additional geometry dynamically as the simulation runs through cloth tearing. So there's not really a good way to export it. But if we select linked with L, we can then invert, delete all of these extra faces here. And then if we look at the UVs of this, since it's a duplicate, we actually get those missing faces removed from the UVs. Now I have this very interesting torn shape within our model here. And if we create a new image here, say we'll just call this alpha, make it black, add a new image, and then if we load up that image here into the base color there so we can see what we're doing, and then if we paint it white here, see we have all of it painted in except for these blank areas here. And now if we go over, turn this off, bring back our more low poly cloth here, we can now change this and we can use it as an alpha mask, and we can have that cloth torn out. This particular simulation was not a particularly great example of this process, but I definitely think there's potential for using this to kind of help create some very interesting alpha masks that you can use for your torn cloth. Now, one more additional really big thing that was added into Blender 5.2 is the online essentials library. So within Blender, if you go under your preferences, under system here, and you have allow online access turned on, then you go to your asset libraries, and under essentials, make sure include online essentials is turned on. You will now have access to some additional assets here. If we go under asset browser, you'll see we actually have a lot of materials, and these are all procedural high quality materials that are provided by Blender. Now you do have to download them. If you'll see this little icon here, click it and it'll download it onto Blender natively for you to use. There's a lot of really good options here, including all of the human base meshes that I used in the rigging video previously. You can also just access these here and download them as you need them. There's also high quality HDRIs available, as well as a few more compositing nodes are available as well, like a paint filter, dithering, Rim 2D, and just a couple of other one of these that are available to download from the online essentials library. So it's definitely worth checking out, downloading some of those and using them. And these materials, especially if we pop them in and on here, I mean, they look really, really good here. And of course, we can always bake these materials down if we want to create textures that we could then export into a game engine. Now, you might notice if you're trying to adjust the settings here, you won't be able to because it's a packed data block, but if you just click this button here, it'll let you adjust it. So now you can play around with settings here, play around with the pattern settings on this, for instance. The wooden boards are a good example as well. Now you can play around with the scale value here, create some more dense boards there. You can play around with the base coloring as well, so you can get whatever kind of colored floorboards you want. You want gray, you want more black boards, you want green boards, anything you want. There's a lot of really good options available within this. And all of these have a lot of options you can play around with. They look fantastic. Definitely recommend using these, playing around with them. And again, you can bake these textures out and use them for whatever you want. One last thing I really want to mention is something that's not here in Blender 5.2 and could potentially not be here for a while, but I want to bring it up. And that's that Blender is planning on adding layered texturing and baking into Blender at some point here in the future. This is on the Blender roadmap here, and if you kind of look through and you read it, it really lets you know that Blender is going to be approaching adding a layered texturing system in a very similar manner to Substance Painter, which I am super excited for. I think it's really going to make Blender a bit of a powerhouse when it comes to creating game assets, be able to do texturing, maybe not on par with Substance Painter, at least for a while, but definitely getting very similar texturing processes from Substance Painter into Blender natively will be so incredibly important. There's going to be a reworking of the baking system, which is going to be so nice. From using the vanilla baking system to bake out textures, there's going to be the ability to bake out utility textures like curve maps and all of that Substance Painter uses. There's going to be generators. There's going to be so much that's going to be added into this. Now again, this is something that could potentially take a few years even to come in, but I do want to point it out because it's something that's been talked about more fairly recently, and I'd love to get more people's attention on this. So if you are a developer yourself and you want to help out with that process, please do. Now that doesn't cover every change and addition that was made to Blender 5.2, and I'm sure some of the changes that I didn't mention still have a place within game asset production, but those were all the changes that I think will have the biggest impact, and I will certainly be incorporating into my own development process for creating game assets. Let me know what you think. What changes would you like to see Blender add? And is there anything I didn't mention in here that you think will be a great addition to the game asset pipeline with Blender? Put it down below in the comments, and if you like this video, leave a like and subscribe for more.